At 15, I was thrown out of my own home. My parents stuffed my clothes into a trash bag and told me I was nothing but a burden. I survived alone, scraping through nights no teenager should ever face. Years later, I walked into my grandmother's funeral wearing a borrowed dress, only to see those same parents arrive in gleaming luxury cars, pretending grief while secretly waiting for the $50 million estate to be announced. The room went silent when the lawyer shuffled the papers, glanced at me with a knowing smile, and declared, "The heir to everything is the one who kept my secret safe." Then, with everyone watching, he pointed directly at me. But what came next left the entire family stunned. Have you ever been cast aside, only to one day find your true worth? Tell me in the comments and let me know, where are you watching from? Hi. My name is Isabel Carter. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a house that on the outside seemed to lack nothing. A tidy red, tiled roof, a neatly trimmed lawn, and a shiny SUV always parked perfectly in the garage. My parents, Linda and Mark Carter, lived for what the neighbors could see: the fashionable dress my mother wore every Sunday morning to church, the expensive watch my father strapped on when he headed to the office, the small parties they hosted just to flaunt their success. But behind that door, there was no room for unconditional love, and even less room for a daughter like me. I was not the straightest student they expected. I was not beautiful or graceful in the way they wanted. To them, I was the wrinkle on the polished mirror they worked so hard to present to the outside world. And then, on one stormy evening when Portland was swallowed in cold fog, they decided to erase that wrinkle completely. The rain tapped hard against the roof as my mother looked straight at me. Her blue eyes were as cold as ice, her voice steady without the faintest tremor. "You are a burden, Isabel. We cannot keep wasting our lives on you." I had not yet opened my mouth when my father appeared from the hallway, holding a black garbage bag in his hand. He did not say a kind word, only silently opened my closet and stuffed each shirt and pair of pants inside as though clearing out useless trash. The rustling sound of plastic scraping against itself echoed through the small room, sharper than any insult. When he shoved the bag into my hands, his raspy voice cut through the air. "Take care of yourself, or don't. Either way, you're no longer our problem." The door slammed shut behind me with a thunderous crack that made my whole body tremble. I stood on the porch, in the freezing rain, clutching the garbage bag that held the remains of my childhood. That night, the streets were quiet, yellow streetlights reflecting off puddles like scattered coins. I turned and looked back at the house I had just been kicked out of, its windows glowing with warm light that was now utterly not for me. I caught glimpses of neighbors drawing curtains, curious eyes watching the scene as though it were a tragic play. But no one opened their door, no one ran out to ask if I needed help. They only whispered behind glass, leaving me standing there in wet clothes with a heart that had just been shattered. In that moment, I understood that my existence had been erased by my parents, as if I had never been part of the Carter family. There was no way back for me, only the dark and the cold rain ahead. The rain hammered down, seeping into every strand of my hair, running down my cheeks and mixing with my tears. I pulled the bag tight against my chest, my hands shook not from the cold but from the shock. I had believed that no matter how strict or harsh my parents were, at least they loved me, but it turned out I was nothing more than an object to be discarded when I no longer fit. Each step I took on the sidewalk felt like carrying 1,000 weights, water splashing in time with my pounding heart. I felt erased from the world, stripped of the right to be a child. Yet in that deepest moment, a small flame was lit inside me. If no one else saw my worth, I would find it myself. If my parents could deny me, then I would prove they were wrong to call me a burden. I did not know how to do it, I did not know where to go, but I knew one thing for certain: I would not let that rainy night be the full stop at the end of my life. I walked that rainy night with no destination, only the instinct to survive guiding me. Around midnight, I found a deserted bus station on the outskirts of Portland, its shelter leaking but enough to keep most of the rain off. I sat on the cold metal bench, clutching the garbage bag to my chest as if it were the last blanket I owned. The rain drummed on the corrugated roof in time with the wind whistling past the streetlight poles, casting that sickly yellow glow. I pulled the bag up against me, tried to close my eyes, but my body trembled and would not calm. That first night, without a roof over my head, I felt utterly unwanted, and it was only the beginning of the wandering days that later I would understand were both punishment and training to make me into someone else. In the days that followed, I moved between the bus station, parks, and sometimes slipped into the 24-hour library downtown. The library smelled of old paper, the light was soft, and the upholstered chairs were far more comfortable than anywhere I had slept. I huddled in a corner of the reading room, pretending to be absorbed in an encyclopedia to avoid attention. Some nights a security guard would make a round, and their gaze would stop on me, then they would walk on in silence. Maybe they understood, maybe they felt pity, but no one asked. I did not beg either, because deep down I feared that to say the words aloud would be to admit I had become homeless. Silence felt like the last shard of dignity I could hold on to. Hunger was the greatest challenge. At first, I tried to endure it, drinking tap water from public fountains to fill my stomach. But by the third day, the hunger made my head spin and my limbs go weak. I no longer had the energy to think about books. All I could hear was my stomach growling. That night, I sneaked around to the back of a small supermarket. The neon lights in front were off, only a flicker came from a broken sign. I waited until an employee tossed a garbage bag out back. My heart hammered as I crept closer, hands trembling as I tore the plastic open. Inside, among wet cardboard boxes and crushed fruit peels, I found half a sandwich, still wrapped in a paper bag. The smell of bread mingled with the stench of plastic made me want to vomit, but I shoved it into my mouth quickly, afraid someone would catch me and afraid that if I hesitated I would collapse from hunger. That was my dinner, and it was the first time I truly understood what it felt like to be regarded as worth less than trash. Hunger was not the only thing that haunted me. Fear did too. Once, while I was curled up on a park bench trying to sleep, a group of kids walked by. They laughed and pointed, and one of them tossed an empty can in my direction. "Hey, little homeless thing, what are you doing here?" Their jeering echoed in my head all night. I clutched my bag and drew myself into a ball like a small animal cornered. Luckily, they did nothing more, but the humiliation stayed with me, etched deep into my memory. I wanted to cry, but the tears seemed to have dried up after so many days of despair. I told myself I could not give in, because if I fell there would be no one in this world to care whether I lived or died. The only thing that kept me moving forward was the memory of Ethan, my little brother. The night I was thrown out, when I turned back for the last time, I saw his face pressed against the second-story window. His eyes were rimmed with red, his small hand tapping on the glass as if trying to break the invisible distance between us. I remember each tear sliding down his cheeks and the way my mother yanked him away from the window, as though she would not allow him to look at me for another second. That image haunted me for years afterward, a wound that would not heal. I knew Ethan did not hate me. He was trapped in the world my parents had built, where love was traded for obedience. It was that memory that became the fragile thread tethering me to the belief that at least one person had once seen me as someone who mattered. After enough nights shivering at the bus station and meals scavenged from dumpsters to understand I could not continue living like that, I realized I needed a job. Any job that would earn me enough money to fill my hungry stomach and buy a new pair of shoes. My chance came at a small cafe on the outskirts of Portland. The owner, a middle-aged Italian woman, hired me to bus tables and mop floors. The work was not easy. Mornings began before dawn, scrubbing coffee, stained cups, polishing tables until they shone, and running back and forth to keep up with the relentless chime of orders. Sometimes difficult customers shouted because I spilled a bit of milk or scolded me because a drink was not hot enough. I gritted my teeth and lowered my head to apologize because every tip, no matter how small, bought me another day. In the evenings, when the cafe emptied, I stayed behind to quietly wipe each tile while old jazz played from a dusty radio. There were nights my hands trembled from exhaustion, but inside I felt lighter, because at least I no longer had to search for food in garbage bags. When I was 17, I decided to get my GED so I would have a chance at higher education. By day, I studied in the library, my eyes glued to pages while my mind was exhausted from lack of sleep. At night, I worked the graveyard shift at a gas station on the highway. The shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., stretching on like something endless. I sold coffee to truck drivers, cleaned the freezing restrooms, and more than once faced drunken customers swaying and cursing. There were nights when the clock read 3 in the morning and I stood staring at my reflection in the dusty glass, my eyes rimmed with dark circles and my cheeks hollowed, suddenly wondering whether I was still a 17-year-old girl or had aged twice my years. But then I would remember Mrs. Eleanor, remember the small envelopes she would quietly leave behind, and I would stand firm again. Each time I heard a truck roar away, I took a deep breath and told myself, I'm still here. I haven't fallen. Winter mornings in Portland were brutal. The sky was a flat gray, wind-biting, and the roads frosted with a thin sheet of ice. I trudged to GED class in shoes with the heels torn out, rain soaking through my socks until my feet went numb. My stomach was hollow, the only thing keeping me awake was a quick cup of black coffee from the gas station. Along the way, I watched classmates my age being driven to school by their parents in warm cars, backpacks slung over their shoulders and hands clutching still warm sandwiches. The sight tightened my chest, but I refused to stop and wallow in self-pity. I kept walking with my chin up, as if the very cold of the path proved my endurance. Every morning in class, my eyes were heavy from sleeplessness, but when the teacher wrote formulas on the board, I copied them diligently, as if every number were a brick building the future I hoped for. When I turned 18, I scraped together the little savings I had, along with a few extra dollars from side jobs, enough to leave Portland and begin a new start in Seattle. I rented a small room in the old attic of a hardware store. The place was shabby, the ceiling stained with watermarks, and whenever it rained hard, drops would drip steadily into the metal basin I kept on the floor. But to me, it was the first home I had ever earned for myself, a place no one could force me to leave. I bought a folding bed, an old desk, and a tiny lamp. At night, that pale yellow light spilled across pages of English, math, and basic economics, the subjects I needed for community college. Each time the wind slipped through the cracks of the window, I pulled the blanket closer, but inside I was filled with pride. I was standing on my own 2 feet. Seattle was vast and cold, but to me, it was opportunity. I enrolled in a community college, working and studying at the same time to cover tuition. I walked from my room to class, through damp streets, breathing in the salt air drifting from the harbor. There were days when 1 packet of instant noodles was all I had to last me, but I still entered the classroom with my worn notebook laid neatly open. I sat in the back row, and no one knew that to be there. I had worked through the night and walked more than an hour in the cold rain. But I knew, and that was enough. Deep down, the wound of being abandoned by my parents never fully healed. There were nights when I sat by the attic window, watching the rush of people below, and loneliness washed over me. I wondered about Ethan, the little brother whose face pressed against the window, crying as I left. How was he living now? Did he ever think of me, or had our parents forced him to forget? That question pierced my heart, yet at the same time reminded me that I had to keep living, keep proving I was not a burden. I was proof to myself. Those years, no matter how hard, became the foundation of my growth. I learned to care for myself. I learned that strength does not come from someone standing behind you, but from rising each time you fall. I was not wealthy, I was not comfortable, but I was proud because every step I took was earned by my own hands. And deep within my heart, I still held onto the promise I made to Mrs. Eleanor, never to betray the faith she placed in me. That promise transformed me from a hopeless wanderer into someone who knew exactly which path she would walk no matter how difficult it became. The call came on a gray afternoon in Seattle, while I was rinsing a cup of cold coffee in my little attic room and trying to read a chapter for the next week's exam. A strange number appeared on the screen, and the raspy voice of a distant relative came through the line. "Isabel? This is Ruth, May's daughter, your cousin from the Southern Branch. Your mother asked me to tell you Mrs. Eleanor has just passed away. The funeral will be held at St. Andrew's church next week. My heart skipped a beat. I knew she had grown weak, but the news still tightened my throat. In my memories, she was a thin figure with calloused hands and kind eyes that always looked at people as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Most striking of all, while my parents saw me as a stain, she saw me differently. She never openly helped me. Perhaps she knew that if she revealed it, Linda and Mark would become angry and forbid me from seeing her forever. But I felt her quiet presence everywhere. There were mornings when I woke on a park bench and found a small envelope tucked into my worn shoe, a $20 bill folded inside. I knew it could only have come from her. On hungry afternoons, passing a familiar corner, I would stumble upon a neatly placed paper bag on the bench. Inside was a still, warm sandwich and a red apple. I never had to ask who it was from. That love was not loud or showy, but it carried me through the darkest days. Sometimes I would sit quietly and eat each bite, tears streaming down my face because someone had thought of me. I promised myself that if one day I could stand on my own, I would never betray her trust. The funeral notice brought not only sorrow but also another storm. I knew that when the news spread, those who had only pretended to care would appear. I had not seen my parents for nearly 10 years. 10 years without a call, without a birthday card, only memories and nights spent scraping by. But now, with the black cloth draped over her name, I knew they would come not for her, but for the estate, for the family photo, for the performance of fake grief. The thought made me shiver, not out of fear but out of exhaustion with that script. I asked myself, should I go? Should I face them after a decade in which they sent me out like trash? The decision to attend did not come from a desire for revenge or a craving to watch them squirm at my success. I went because Mrs. Eleanor deserved to be sent off with final respect, and because of the promise she had made. Keep the faith, do not let betrayal turn you into a petty person. I thought of the moment she stooped to hand me the wooden box, of her warm words in the winter night. Hold on to your faith, child. One day you will understand why I chose you. She chose me, now I had to choose how to say goodbye. I needed to go there to place a small flower on her coffin, to thank her in silence, to say the farewell I had not had a chance to speak while she was still alive. I called Emma, my roommate. She worked at the hair salon near campus, the one who had shared slices of cake with me and lent me a coat on cold nights. Emma, I need to borrow a black dress, I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Emma did not ask questions. She quietly opened the wardrobe and handed me the dress she wore to interviews. Thin fabric, round collar, simple but respectful. Does it fit? She asked. I nodded, grateful to the point of choking. The dress was not mine, but it became the garment that let me step into a ceremony my heart needed to be soothed by. On the day of the funeral, I washed my face carefully, smoothed my hair, and slipped the small wooden box into my purse as if carrying a part of her soul. The old car I had bought with money saved from my shifts, the car that had cost me nights of work at the gas station, started with a cough and a puff of gray smoke. I drove through familiar streets, watching buildings pierce the clouds, the map of my memories unfolding behind me. The places I had slept, the diners where I worked nights, the corners where she had once left sandwiches for me. Each stretch of road was a story, and I drove as if to gather all those stories together and bring them to the place where I would leave a final chapter for her. That morning street. Andrew's church looked as though it were draped in a grand white veil, beautiful, yet unbearably heavy. Every aisle overflowed with white lilies, chrysanthemums, and roses, arranged in towering crystal vases, while the light from the stained glass windows spilled down, making the space shimmer but also feel cold. The sweet fragrance of flowers mixed with the scent of candle wax, creating an atmosphere that was solemn and oppressive all at once. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors, clutching my purse at my side, my feet feeling as though they were made of stone. Every gaze seemed to sweep over me. No one waved, no one greeted me, but I knew there were whispers. Inside me, another whisper rose louder than all of theirs. I was not here to blend in. I was here to say goodbye to Mrs. Eleanor. At the front, the coffin lay covered in immaculate white velvet, set neatly upon the platform. Above it hung a large portrait of her. She looked straight into the camera with her stern eyes, her lips pressed in a familiar firmness that still carried warmth. I stood staring for a long time, my chest tightening as though it were being crushed. The whole world might have turned its back on me, but those eyes had never abandoned me. Just looking at her picture, I could hear the echo of her words. "Hold on to your faith, child." The sound of high heels clicking sharply against the stone floor suddenly turned heads. My mother Linda appeared in a tight black dress, a string of pearls glittering at her throat. My father Mark walked beside her, clad in a perfectly tailored suit with a neat black tie. They had stepped out of the gleaming Lexus that had just pulled up in front of the church, the car flashing in the sunlight like a quiet proclamation of wealth. Linda clung to Mark's arm, their faces deliberately arranged into an expression of sorrow, eyes shimmering as though they bore the greatest loss of all. But I knew the truth, they were not here to mourn her, they were here to perform, to claim their share of the inheritance she had left behind. I kept to the back row, trying not to let my eyes meet theirs, but I could still see every detail of their performance. From time to time Linda dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, then glanced around to make sure someone was watching. Mark shook hands with acquaintances, his face set in solemn lines, though the corners of his mouth twitched as if always on the verge of a smirk. The solemnity of the funeral suddenly felt like a stage where they performed a play that everyone silently understood was false. Among the crowd, my eyes found Ethan. My little brother was now 22, taller, more composed than before. The suit he wore must have been chosen by our parents, perfectly fitted and gleaming. He stood beside them, but his eyes wavered, avoiding direct contact. When he noticed me, his eyes widened, a flicker of emotion breaking through, but then quickly dropped, as if afraid to be caught. I recognized the struggle in that look, the memory of the boy pressing his face to the glass crying for his sister, and the invisible chains binding him now. My heart sank. I longed to run to him, to embrace him, but I knew the wall between us was still too thick. The ceremony began with the slow notes of the organ, the pastor's voice echoing as he described Eleanor's life of tireless work and quiet love. I listened, but beneath his words I could still hear the whispers running through the pews. What seemed like hushed conversations were sharp in my ears. I heard she left behind a fortune. Around $5 million. I wonder who will get the most. It felt as though their attention was less on the soul that had passed than on the wealth left behind. I bowed my head, sorrow welling for her, a woman who had lived frugally, worked diligently, and in the end had become nothing more than the centerpiece of cold calculations. The air in the church grew heavier, like a coarse cloth smothering every breath. I sat silently, clutching the hem of the borrowed dress, listening to the sound of shoes on stone, the creak of wooden benches, and feeling the tension rise by the minute. No one said it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. The estate. Discreet glances turned toward Lawyer Hayes, who sat solemnly in the front row with his briefcase neatly placed at his feet. In those eyes there was ambition, hope, and an unabashed hunger. I looked around and saw the bitter contrast. Bouquets of pristine white flowers suggesting peace and love, while in the hearts of the living there was only greed and falsehood. Expensive dresses, gold rings flashing under candlelight, strained smiles together, they painted a scene half tragic, half staged. And I, the girl once thrown out like trash, now returned in a borrowed dress and worn shoes, stood at the edge of that drama simply to see off the one person who had believed in me. For a moment I rested my hand on my bag, where the wooden box she had given me lay. The cool, hard wood under the fabric steadied me in an odd way, like a reminder that I was not alone. She had chosen me, and even if this whole room glittered with deception, I still had a truth to hold. I drew a deep breath, closed my eyes, and told myself, it is not so they can see me suffer. It is so I can say goodbye to the one person who never forgot me. The funeral music gradually faded, leaving only the sound of soft coughs and the creak of wooden pews in the solemn church. Everyone straightened as a tall man with silver streaks in his hair rose from the front row. He adjusted his black tie, bowed to the pastor, and stepped toward the lectern. It was Mr. Hayes, Eleanor's longtime lawyer and loyal friend. His face was calm, his voice deep and steady as it carried through the room, instantly commanding silence. "My name is Robert Hayes, attorney and executor of Eleanor Carter's will," he began, his eyes pausing on each face in turn. "According to her wishes, I will read the provisions here today, in the presence of family and close friends." When he opened the leather case, the metallic snap of the clasp echoed through the sanctuary, and as if on cue, every person in the room tensed in anticipation. He began with the smaller bequests, his voice even, yet each word he read seemed to tighten the air another notch. First, Mrs. Eleanor leaves a sum of $250,000 to the Portland Children's Fund, a charity she had quietly supported for over 20 years. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, some nodding in impressed acknowledgement. Then he continued. She has also set aside $100,000 for each of the longtime employees at her flower shop. She considered them family. I felt a faint smile cross my lips as I pictured the gentle faces of those who had helped her tend every bloom, now remembered by her with gratitude. Mr. Hayes went on to list other gifts, a few small parcels of land to distant relatives, some heirlooms for grandchildren in another branch of the family. Those named sighed with relief, whispering to each other with subdued contentment, but everyone knew these were only preludes. What they were truly waiting for, the reason my parents' eyes had gleamed from the moment they stepped out of the Lexus, was the final portion. The vast fortune Eleanor had accumulated over a lifetime. The atmosphere grew dense and heavy. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second cutting through the silence, mingling with the shallow, anxious breaths of those around me. My mother's hand tightened on my father's arm, while he adjusted his tie and drew in a long breath, as though bracing for triumph. I saw eyes glinting, greed unveiled in every furtive glance toward the lawyer's briefcase. And then, after turning to the final page, Mr. Hayes paused. He lifted his eyes, scanning the room, as though weighing every soul. A silence stretched until it grew suffocating. Then his voice came, low and deliberate. "The remainder of Mrs. Eleanor Carter's estate, including real property, bank accounts, shares, and business holdings valued at approximately $50 million, will not be divided among many. It will go to one person alone." A rush of whispers flared instantly, only to be stifled as if strangled midair. I saw my mother sit up straighter, her chest heaving, her eyes glistening with certainty that her name was about to be spoken. My father nodded to himself, as though convinced it could only be his, the eldest son's, right. Ethan's head hung low, his fingers nervously twisting the edge of his suit jacket. And I sat perfectly still, forcing my heart to keep from pounding out of control. "Mr. Hayes continued, his tone slower now, each word weighted. "The sole heir will be the one who kept my secret safe until the end of my life." His words cracked through the church like thunder. Faces turned toward each other in bewilderment, brows furrowed, lips moving with whispers. What secret? The silence that followed was heavier than even the pause before he had spoken. Immediately, many eyes turned toward my parents. Some whispered that surely Mark and Linda must have safeguarded something for Eleanor, perhaps business documents or a portion of her assets. I saw my mother press her lips together, her face glowing as though certain the title was hers. My father leaned back with quiet confidence, the corner of his mouth curled in a smirk, his eyes scanning the room as if ready to receive admiration. But then the unexpected happened. Mr. Hayes paused, his lips curving into an unreadable smile. He did not direct his gaze toward the front row where my parents sat today. Instead, he turned his head toward the back of the church, toward where I sat quietly in the shadows. I felt the entire room shift with the pull of his eyes. My heart lurched as he slowly raised his hand, his finger pointing straight at me. "That person," he declared, his voice firm and unwavering, "is Isabel Carter." The room erupted in gasps. I heard chairs clatter, my mother's breath quicken, my father spring to his feet in fury. Every eye fixed on me, the girl in a borrowed dress and worn-out shoes, sitting in the last pew. In that instant, I was no longer the child cast out of her home with a garbage bag in hand. I sat upright, palms slick with sweat, and met the bewildered faces turned toward me. I did not know what awaited me, but I understood one thing. This was the destined moment one Eleanor had foreseen long ago. The moment Mr. Hayes finished, dozens of eyes turned to me astonished, suspicious, angry. I heard my mother whisper shout, "Impossible." And my father say through gritted teeth, "There must be a mistake." But Mr. Hayes did not look at them. He kept his gaze on me, his face solemn yet holding a strange confidence. He stepped forward and spoke clearly, without hesitation. "Isabel, do you still have the box that Mrs. Eleanor gave you?" That question pulled me back to 10 years earlier, to a freezing winter night when I thought I might not survive. I was only 15 then, thrown out of the house, my feet blue in my torn shoes, my stomach gnawing with hunger. I curled up on a park bench, wrapped in dense frost, my breath a faint mist. I remember thinking that maybe I would not wake up the next morning. In the dizzying blur, I heard slow footsteps. When I looked up, I saw Mrs. Eleanor's figure, silver hair beneath a knit hat, a heavy dark coat, eyes bright in the night. She did not rush to hug me or shed pitying tears. She sat down beside me and, with hands that trembled but were steady, placed her hand on my shoulder. I remember her voice then, low and warm. "You are young, Isabel, but stronger than you think. I cannot change how your parents treat you, but I can place my trust in you." She reached into her basket and handed me a small wooden box, worn but sturdy, its dark brown wood rimmed in worn brass, locked with a tiny brass padlock. "Do not open it until the time comes," she said slowly. "Inside is the reason I trusted you, and proof that you are not a burden. Keep it with all your heart. One day, you will understand why I chose you." I nodded, tears on my cheeks, and in that moment I felt I was not entirely abandoned. For 10 years after that, the box was my constant companion. It rode in my bag as I drifted between bus stations, lay beneath my pillow in the attic room in Seattle, and sat neatly on a shelf whenever I forced myself to study through the night. There were nights when hunger gnawed so fiercely that I considered pawning it. Selling the box would buy me enough food for a week, maybe a month. I walked to pawn shops more than once, the box clutched in my hands, but each time I paused and remembered her eyes and her warning. "Do not open it until the time comes." And I turned away. To me, keeping the box was like holding onto the last scrap of faith, a belief that someone out there still thought I mattered. Back in the present, when Mr. Hayes asked, my heart hammered. I bent forward, opened the purse I had kept pressed to my side all morning, and from the black fabric raised the old wooden box. Light from the chandelier above fell on it, catching the scratches and the edges worn smooth by years of handling. A murmur rippled through the room. A few people gasped, "What is that?" My father half rose, his face flushing red. "This is nonsense. That proves nothing," he snapped. My mother clung to his arm, trembling, eyes wide with shock. I held the box tightly with both hands, feeling its weight, not just a few ounces of wood, but 10 years of memories, 10 years of a promise. I took a long breath, forcing my voice steady. "She gave this to me the night I thought I would not have the strength to live. She told me to keep it until the right time. And for 10 years I have never betrayed that promise." The room fell into a tense silence. Ethan, my brother, sat a few rows away, his eyes wide on the box, his face a mix of astonishment and emotion. I caught his gaze, and in that instant I saw the same look he once had pressed against the window when I was sent away. Now his eyes were full of regret and sorrow. I tightened my grip on the box, feeling the rough scratches on its surface as if they deepened my resolve. I knew this moment would change everything. 10 years earlier they had thrown me out, called me a burden. But now I stood before them, before friends, before the community, with proof that the strongest woman in our family had placed her full trust in me. No matter how loudly they screamed or how much they protested, that truth could not be erased. I looked up toward the lectern, my voice clearer than ever. She trusted me, and I kept my promise. Mr. Hayes stepped forward, his eyes searching mine one last time before he slowly drew a small brass key from the pocket of his coat. "Mrs. Eleanor entrusted me with this key," he said, his voice low but resonant. with the instruction that it should only be used if Isabel produced the box. The church was so silent I could hear the pounding of my own heartbeat. My father shouted, "Stop this, this is a farce. No one has the right to do this in front of us." But Mr. Hayes did not so much as glance at him. Calmly, he held the key out to me. I took a long breath, nodded, and together we turned the tiny lock. The click rang out soft, yet it rolled through the church like thunder. The lid lifted. Inside was not gold or bank documents as many had expected, but a leather-bound notebook with frayed edges and several sealed envelopes. On the cover, in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Isabel, the only grandchild who understands the value of loyalty." My hands trembled as I lifted the book, feeling the ridges of its ink-pressed pages. Mr. Hayes opened to the first page and read aloud so all could hear. Date. Today I record the truth because I know there will come a time when it must be spoken. My son, Mark, and his wife, Linda, have on many occasions taken advantage of me, forcing me to transfer money from the flower shop into their shadowy accounts. They treated the work of my lifetime as nothing more than a tool to flaunt their status and cover their debts. They deceived me, and they stole my trust. All. The words cut through the air like blades. I saw my mother's face drain of color, while my father flushed crimson, his hands gripping the pew so tightly the veins stood out on his knuckles. Mr. Hayes turned to another passage, his voice steady and unshakable. "I know that in their eyes, Isabel is nothing but a burden. But I have seen how strong she is, how she kept her promise even through poverty. She never asked me for anything, except a little kindness. That is what makes her different. I chose Isabel because she understands the value of loyalty. She kept my secret, and she kept her dignity." At those words, tears spilled down my cheeks, my hands trembling as they clutched the notebook. I was not crying from sorrow, but because, at last, the life I had lived and the suffering I had endured were acknowledged. Mr. Hayes then drew out a sealed envelope and opened it before everyone. Inside were legal documents, the notarized will, deeds transferring real estate, bank account papers, and business shares. Every one of them bore my name, Isabel Carter, as the sole heir. "All of this was legally prepared 3 years ago," Mr. Hayes declared firmly. "There are no provisions that can be contested. The entire estate, valued at $50 million, is transferred to Isabel Carter." For a heartbeat the room held its breath, then erupted in chaos. My father roared, "This is fraud. She was manipulated. I'll take this to court." My mother burst into tears, clutching his arm and screaming, "No. That money belongs to our family. She doesn't deserve it." Their voices echoed through the church, sharp and desperate, while guests whispered nervously. Some distant relatives rose, trying to calm them, but their efforts only fueled the turmoil. Mr. Hayes remained composed. He placed the notebook and documents neatly on the lectern, lifted his head, and looked straight at my parents. Mark, Linda, Mrs. Eleanor anticipated everything. "This will has been fully notarized with witnesses' signatures. Your financial records have been verified, and all evidence of fraudulent activity is documented in this journal. No court can deny the truth. This is Eleanor's final wish, and it will be carried out." His voice was low but firm, like a hammer striking a nail. After the will was read, the room fell into an odd, heavy silence. Only the rustle of paper sounded as Mr. Hayes carefully packed the files back into his case. I sat there clutching Eleanor's journal, feeling both trembling and strangely calm. Then my mother's voice cut through, thin and furious, ripping the air like a blade. "What have you done, Isabel? You've destroyed this family. You're a traitor, unfilial. From a useless child you've come back to steal everything from us." Her tears streamed down, but her eyes burned with hatred, her hands trembling as if she might lunge to snatch the journal from me. My father's voice was hoarse with anger. "Yes, you're nothing but vengeance. You don't deserve the Carter name. Everything we built, you've stolen. This is a crime, Isabel, your crime." I stood up slowly. For a moment, my legs felt unsteady, but then a strength from deep inside made me keep my back straight. I looked them square in the eye, my voice no longer trembling as before but clear and decisive. No, parents. This family destroyed itself the night you shoved my things into a garbage bag and threw me out into the cold rain. You no longer have the right to call me a traitor, because you betrayed me first, you betrayed your duties as parents, you betrayed the unconditional love a child deserves. The room fell utterly silent. I felt my heart racing, but my words poured out, stronger than ever. She chose me not because I wanted money. She chose me because I never betrayed her, never turned my back on the trust she placed in me. While you exploited her, committed financial fraud, and only cared about flaunting status, I, the child you called a burden, was the only one who kept the promise. My mother's mouth dropped open, her eyes wide in disbelief that I would dare speak that way. My father's face flushed. He stepped forward, growling. You're just an ungrateful brat, surviving by luck and now daring to lecture your parents. He was about to speak more, but another voice rang out, trembling yet strong. No, you are wrong. Ethan, my brother, suddenly stood up. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with a determination I had never seen before. He looked straight at our parents, his voice wavering yet firm. I have been silent for too long. All these years, you hid the truth, always saying Isabel left because she couldn't handle responsibility, that she didn't care about us. But today, I know those were lies. You were the ones who drove her away, leaving her in the rain that night. You were the ones who exploited her, who took Mrs. Eleanor's money for frivolous things. Whispers spread around the room, every gaze turning toward my parents. I looked at Ethan, my heart tightening. In his eyes, I saw years of suppressed guilt, but also the light of truth finally set free. He turned to look at me, his lips pressed together, and gave a small nod as if offering a belated apology. My mother began to wail, her voice choked. Ethan, are you against me too? Do all of you want to destroy me? My father's face darkened, his voice hoarse and full of fury. You will all regret this. Isabel, you think you've won, but you've only shamed this family. I swear I will not let this go. Ah. I let out a long breath as I looked at them, the people who had once been my whole world as a child, now nothing more than two strangers filled with hatred. I shook my head gently, my voice calmer than it had ever been. No, mother. No, father. The shame is your own doing. I do not need revenge. I do not need to destroy you. The truth has spoken. She chose me. And that choice is something no one can change. Although the room seemed to erupt, every gaze shifting, watching my parents in their rawest moment. They looked around and saw familiar faces turning away, old friends whispering behind their hands, and even their youngest son no longer standing with them. My mother clung to my father's arm, trembling, while his face burned red, his eyes blazing with fury. Then suddenly, he turned, dragging her toward the doors, their furious footsteps echoing through the sanctuary. The church doors slammed shut behind them, leaving a heavy emptiness in their wake. I heard sighs ripple through the air, the scrape of wooden pews shifting, whispers spreading like wind. But above it all, I felt something I had not known in years, relief. It was as if a great stone that had weighed on me for a decade had finally been lifted. I looked down at the journal in my hands, then raised my eyes to see the light streaming through the stained glass, falling across me and Ethan. He stepped closer, whispering, "I'm sorry, Isabel. I knew, but I was too afraid. From now on, I don't want to be silent anymore." I pulled him into an embrace, feeling his shoulders tremble, and whispered back, "It's not too late. We can still begin again." In that moment, I knew I had found my freedom. Not because I now held a vast fortune in my hands, but because for the first time I had stood tall before my parents, spoken the truth, and felt no fear. The invisible chains of the past had fallen away, leaving me free to be myself, free to choose a new family built on love and loyalty. After the funeral and the family chaos, the weeks that followed passed like a storm with me at its center. Lawyer Hayes walked beside me through every step of the process, from transferring bank accounts and signing property deeds to the formal legal confirmation of the will. The press began reporting on the unexpected heir of Eleanor Carter, With local papers publishing photographs of me leaving Hayes's office, Eleanor's leather journal clutched in my hands. Many were curious, some were skeptical, but I no longer felt the pressure to explain. For the first time in my life, the truth was on my side. The $50 million inheritance did change everything. But when I looked at those figures on paper, I did not think of luxury estates or expensive cars. I thought of that winter night at 15, shivering on a park bench, my stomach so empty I nearly pawned the wooden box. I thought of the eyes of homeless children I often saw outside supermarkets, eyes I understood better than anyone. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I told Hayes I wanted to establish a foundation for abandoned children, a scholarship and support program bearing her name. The Eleanor Carter Foundation. He nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "Eleanor would be proud of you," he said. And so, in the months that followed, I threw myself into the work, meeting with social organizations, consulting with education experts, and working alongside a team of lawyers to draft bylaws. I was no longer the girl hiding in the last pew of the church. I sat at a large table, signing important documents, deciding budgets that would open doors for children like the one I once was. The day of the foundation's inauguration came faster than I expected. The Seattle Central Theater was packed with guests, reporters crowding the lobby. On stage, a pristine white backdrop bore bold letters, "The Eleanor Carter Foundation, for Children Without a Home." I stood behind the curtain, wearing a simple navy dress, clutching my speech tightly in my hands. Ethan sat in the front row, meeting my eyes with a small nod, as if to lend me his strength. My heart was racing, but this time it was not from fear. When I stepped onto the stage, camera flashes burst like fireworks, white light flooding my vision. I drew a deep breath and began. 10 years ago, I believed I was nothing but a burden. My parents told me so, and they believed it was true. But there was one person who did not. My grandmother, Eleanor Carter, believed that loyalty and dignity could save a person. She gave me a small box and a great faith. And today, with her legacy, I want to return that faith to the children out there who feel abandoned. I looked out over the audience and saw many faces glistening with tears. The clicks of cameras and the scratching of pens never ceased. I continued. This foundation will provide scholarships, housing, and above all faith that these children are worthy of love and worthy of the same opportunities as anyone else. Because the value of a human being does not come from whose blood they carry, but from resilience, loyalty, and true love. My voice was steady, each word resonating through the hall. I felt a calmness in my heart, a feeling I had not touched in years. I no longer waited for my parents to appear and acknowledge me. I no longer longed for an apology. I chose myself, the path Eleanor had laid before me. I chose what was real. My greatest victory was not in making my parents regret, but in no longer allowing them to define my worth. Applause thundered across the theater. I bowed in gratitude, warmth spreading all around me. For a fleeting moment, I thought of her image in an old photograph, lips pressed in that familiar smile. I believed that somewhere, she was watching me, proud and at peace. When the ceremony ended, I stepped out of the lights, leaving the stage and moving into the corridor behind it. The echo of applause still followed, but I smiled, my heart unburdened. I was no longer the 15-year-old girl cast out into the night with a garbage bag in her hands. I was Isabel Carter, a woman who knew her own worth. And more than anything, I was free. The final message I want to leave with anyone listening to this story is this. Your worth does not come from how others see you, even if they are your own flesh and blood. It comes from the determination you keep in your heart, from the loyalty you hold to your own promises, and from the real love you give to those who deserve it. Never let anyone define you as a burden. Because only when you choose yourself will you find true freedom, peace, and happiness. And with that smile, I stepped out of the lights, serene as if breathing freely for the very first time. Thank you for listening. I look forward to seeing you again in the next family stories, shared daily here on Familial Stories Exposed.